Sometimes the hardest part of losing someone isn't saying goodbye. It's learning to live with the pieces of their world they left behind. For Raymond Cook, that piece was his late wife's beloved mare, Daisy, a gentle reminder of love that once filled his empty farmhouse. On a simple trip to get her hooves trimmed, the farrier discovers something hidden deep in her shoe, a small metal locket with an old photograph and a mysterious name. This discovery opens a decades-old mystery about a missing farmhand who vanished without a trace. As Raymond teams up with a retired sheriff to solve the puzzle, he faces his own buried guilt about lost friendships and mischances. What secret was someone desperate enough to hide beneath a horse's hoof? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Millbrook Valley like an old man's memories, persistent, familiar, and not quite ready to let go. Raymond Cook stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug warming his weathered hands, watching Daisy graze in the pasture that stretched beyond the white picket fence Martha had insisted on painting every spring. The fence needed painting again. Everything seemed to need something these days. At 67, Raymond had learned that grief wasn't the sharp, cutting thing people warned you about. It was more like a dull ache that settled into your bones, coloring every sunrise a little differently than it used to be. 2 years had passed since Martha's funeral, but the farmhouse still felt too big, too quiet, too full of echoes from conversations that would never resume. He opened Martha's garden journal, its leather cover soft from years of her gentle handling. Her careful handwriting documented 15 seasons of plantings, weather observations, and small victories against aphids and drought. June 15th, she'd written 3 years ago. Daisy seems restless today. Wonder if horses sense changes in weather the way Martha's grandmother claimed they could. Raymond smiled despite himself. Martha had always written about herself in third person when she was thinking out loud on paper. The journal fell open to a page from last spring, the final entries before her illness took her strength for gardening. Her handwriting had grown shakier, but her observations remained keen. The clematis needs support. Raymond promises to build a trellis, but I know he's worried about me. Some promises matter more than others. Remember to tell him Daisy's hoof needs attention soon. Raymond set down his coffee and pulled on the worn work boots he'd been meaning to replace for 3 years. The morning air carried the scent of hay and honeysuckle, mixed with that indefinable smell of a farm where life continued its ancient rhythms regardless of human sorrow. Daisy lifted her head as he approached, her brown eyes gentle and knowing. She was a rescue horse Martha had insisted on taking in 12 years ago, a mare too old for breeding, too gentle for racing, but perfect for a woman who believed every creature deserved kindness. "Morning, girl," Raymond murmured, running his hand along her neck. The mare's coat was showing her age, gray threads mixing with the chestnut brown that had once gleamed like polished wood. Martha used to brush Daisy every evening, talking to her about the day's small dramas and quiet joys. Raymond had continued the ritual, though his conversation skills weren't quite what Martha's had been. He slipped the worn leather halter over Daisy's head, feeling the supple leather that Martha's hands had softened over years of use. The halter was more than equipment. It was a bridge between the life he'd shared with Martha and the solitary existence he was still learning to navigate. Every buckle, every worn spot told a story of patient evenings, of Martha's gentle voice, explaining to Daisy that the halter meant safety, meant care, meant someone who wouldn't abandon you. "Your hooves are getting long," Raymond said, lifting Daisy's front foot to examine the growth. "Doc Peterson's been after me to bring you in. You know how he gets when folks let their horses go too long between trimmings." The walk to the barn gave Raymond time to notice things Martha would have pointed out, the way the morning light caught the spider webs in the fence corners, The sound of blue jays arguing in the oak tree by the well, the fact that the garden gate was hanging crooked again. These observations used to be shared, discussed, turned into gentle projects for quiet afternoons. Now they accumulated in Raymond's mind like unopened letters, full of small importance, but no one to deliver them to Dot in the barn. Daisy stood patiently while Raymond loaded her into the trailer. She'd made this trip dozens of times over the years, trusting that wherever Raymond took her, she'd come home again. That trust meant something to Raymond, especially on mornings when he wondered if he was doing right by Martha's memory, by Daisy, by the life they'd all built together. The drive into town took him past the Morrison farm, where David Morrison's new equipment gleamed in fields that had grown corn and soybeans for 4 generations. The Morrison place had always been the most prosperous in the valley, their white farmhouse pristine, their fences straight, their success a constant reminder of what hard work and good fortune could accomplish. Raymond had never been envious. He and Martha had been happy with their smaller piece of the world, but he'd always respected the Morrison family's dedication to the land. Main Street in Millbrook hadn't changed much in the 43 years Raymond had been driving through it. The same brick buildings housed the same family businesses, though some of the names on the signs had changed as children inherited what their parents had built. Peterson's farrier service occupied the same corner building where Doc Peterson's father had shod horses for the cavalry during World War II. The continuity of it comforted Raymond, even as he recognized that his own life lacked the succession that kept family businesses alive. His children, David in Portland and Susan in Chicago, called every Sunday, their voices careful with the kind of concern that comes from loving someone who lives too far away to help with daily troubles. They worried about him living alone, suggested he consider moving closer to one of them, spoke gently about the burden of maintaining a farm at his age. Raymond understood their concern, even shared some of it, but he wasn't ready to make those decisions yet. The farm still felt like Martha, still held too many conversations unfinished to abandon. Tom and Helen Reeves, his nearest neighbors, had been checking on him with increasing frequency since Martha's death. Helen brought casseroles that lasted in 3 days, while Tom helped with repairs that required 2 pairs of hands. They were good people, the kind Martha had always said made rural life worth the isolation and inconvenience. But Raymond could see the worry in their eyes when they thought he wasn't looking, the way they exchanged glances when he mentioned projects he planned to tackle alone. Doc Peterson emerged from his shop as Raymond pulled up, wiping his hands on a leather apron that had seen 40 years of service. At 73, Doc moved with the deliberate care of a man who'd learned to respect his body's limitations, but his eyes remained sharp and his hands steady. He'd known Martha since she was a girl, had attended their wedding, had been one of the few people who could make Martha laugh during the hardest days of her illness. Raymond, Doc called, his voice carrying the warmth of old friendship. Figured you'd be by soon. Martha's been gone 2 years now, and you've been putting off Daisy's hoof care for longer than she'd approve of. The gentle rebuke carried no sting. Doc Peterson had earned the right to speak plainly about responsibility and care. He'd been teaching people about horse care since before Raymond and Martha bought their farm, and his advice came from decades of watching what happened when people neglected the animals they claimed to love. You're right, Raymond admitted, opening the trailer door. Been meaning to call, but you know how it is. Doc nodded, understanding everything Raymond couldn't quite say about how difficult it had become to make decisions, even simple ones, without Martha's voice to confirm his choices. She's looking good, considering, Doc said, running his hands along Daisy's legs with professional assessment. Martha always took good care of her. You've been doing right by her memory. They led Daisy into the shop, where the familiar sounds and smells of Doc Peterson's trade filled the air. The rasp of files against hoof, the smell of hot metal and leather, the solid thunk of hammer against anvil. This was a place where ancient skills met modern problems, where patience and experience mattered more than speed or technology. "How you been holding up?" Doc asked as he began his examination of Daisy's hooves. The question carried the weight of genuine concern, not mere politeness. "Some days better than others," Raymond answered honestly. "The quiet takes getting used to." Doc Peterson had been a widower for 8 years, losing his Eleanor to the same cancer that eventually claimed Martha. He understood the shape of Raymond's silence, the way grief could make ordinary decisions feel impossibly complex. "Martha wouldn't want you to stop living," Doc said quietly, lifting Daisy's front hoof. "She'd want you to find your way back to purpose. Might take time, but she'd want you to find it." Raymond nodded, watching Doc work with tools his father had used, continuing traditions that connected him to generations of men who'd cared for horses when horses were essential to life, rather than companions for leisure. There was something reassuring about the continuity, about the way some things remained constant even when the world seemed to be changing too fast to follow. The morning settled into the comfortable rhythm of old friends working together, each understanding his role, neither feeling the need to fill every silence with conversation. Raymond held Daisy's lead while Doc examined each hoof, noting the growth patterns and checking for problems that could cause lameness if left untreated. It was Doc who noticed it first, a slight unevenness in Daisy's left rear hoof, something that shouldn't have been there. As he cleaned away the packed dirt and debris, his expression changed from routine concentration to puzzled interest. "That's curious," he murmured, peering closely at something lodged deep in the hoof's natural groove. "Raymond, come take a look at this." Raymond leaned closer, squinting at what Doc Peterson's experienced fingers had discovered. Wedged deep into the natural groove of Daisy's left rear hoof, something metallic caught the morning light filtering through the shop's dusty windows. It wasn't a stone or a piece of debris. This was something that had been deliberately placed, something that had been hidden. "Hold her steady," Doc murmured, reaching for a pair of long-nosed pliers from his workbench. "Whatever this is, it's been there a while. The hoof's grown around it some." Daisy shifted slightly, but remained patient, trusting the hands that had cared for her hooves for over a decade. Raymond stroked her neck, feeling his own pulse quicken as Doc worked carefully to extract whatever had been concealed in such an unlikely hiding place. The object came free with a soft, scraping sound, a small tarnished piece of metal about the size of a silver dollar. Doc Peterson held it up to the light, and both men could see it was a locket, its surface green with age and exposure. The chain had long since broken away, leaving only the pendant itself, its surface etched with delicate engravings that time had nearly worn smooth. "I'll be damned," Doc whispered, turning the locket over in his palm. "In 40 years of shoeing horses, I've never seen anything like this." Raymond accepted the locket when Doc handed it to him, feeling the weight of it, not just the physical weight of old metal, but something deeper, more significant. The tarnish couldn't completely obscure the craftsmanship. This had been beautiful once, important enough to someone that they'd risked everything to hide it. "Can it be opened?" Raymond asked, running his thumb over the edge where two halves of the locket met. Doc Peterson examined the mechanism with the same careful attention he gave to examining a horse's hoof for problems. "Looks like it opens here," he said, pointing to a small catch nearly invisible beneath the tarnish. "But it's stuck tight. Years of moisture and dirt have sealed it pretty well." They moved to Doc's workbench, where better light and proper tools made the delicate work easier. Doc selected a small file and began working on the catch, careful not to damage whatever might be inside. The metal was stubborn, corroded by time and the unique environment of a horse's hoof, but Doc Peterson had the patience of a man who'd spent decades coaxing cooperation from reluctant hardware. "There," Doc said finally, as the catch yielded with a tiny click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet shop. The locket opened like a book, revealing its secrets to daylight for the first time in years. On one side, protected by the metal housing, was a small photograph, the kind taken at those photo booths in shopping centers. Slightly faded, but still clear enough to see the subject. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, smiled at the camera with the kind of hopeful expression that suggested she believed the future held good things. She was beautiful in an understated way, with dark hair pulled back from a face that radiated warmth and intelligence. Her clothing suggested the photograph had been taken sometime in the 1980s. The style of her blouse, the way her hair was arranged, even the quality of the photograph itself spoke of an earlier. On the other side of the locket, folded into a space barely large enough to contain it, was a piece of paper. Doc Peterson used tweezers to extract it carefully, unfolding it with the delicacy of someone handling ancient parchment. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the writing was still legible, a name written in careful script. Elena Vasquez, followed by a partial date that read June 1987. Raymond and Doc stared at the evidence in silence, each processing the implications of what they'd discovered. This wasn't random debris that had somehow found its way into a horse's hoof. Someone had deliberately placed this locket there, hidden it so carefully that it might never have been found if Doc Peterson hadn't been so thorough in his examination. Elena Vasquez. Raymond repeated the name slowly, as if saying it aloud might summon some memory or recognition. I don't know that name. Do you? Doc Peterson shook his head, but his expression had grown thoughtful. 1987, he said. That's over 30 years ago. But I remember that year. There was some trouble in the valley that summer. Missing person case, I think. Sheriff was asking questions around all the farms. The memory was vague but persistent, the way recollections surface after being buried by decades of more immediate concerns. Doc Peterson had been a young man then, newly married to Eleanor, focused on building his business and starting a family. But he remembered the tension that had settled over the farming community that summer, the way conversations stopped when strangers approached, the careful way. People chose their words when discussing who had worked where and when. We should call Sheriff Murphy, Raymond said, though the words felt strange in his mouth. At 67, he'd lived his entire life without having occasion to contact law enforcement about anything more serious than a neighbor's dog getting loose. But this felt different, important in a way that demanded official attention. Doc Peterson nodded, understanding that whatever they'd stumbled upon was bigger than either of them could handle alone. Murphy's retired now, but he still helps with cold cases. If anybody would remember a missing person from 1987, it'd be him. They carefully wrapped the locket and its contents in a clean cloth, treating it with the respect due to evidence in what might be a crime that had gone unsolved for over 3 decades. Raymond tucked the bundle into his shirt pocket, feeling its weight against his chest like a responsibility he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. The drive home felt different than the morning journey into town. Daisy rode quietly in the trailer, unaware that she'd been carrying someone else's secret for who knew how long. Raymond found himself looking at familiar landmarks with new eyes, wondering what other secrets the valley might be keeping. What other stories lay buried beneath the peaceful surface of rural life. The hills that had always seemed protective now felt somehow watchful, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen now that Elena Vasquez's name had been spoken aloud again after so many years of silence. The Morrison farm, prosperous and well-maintained, looked no different than it had that morning. But Raymond found himself wondering about the workers who had passed through those fields in 1987, about the young woman whose photograph now rested in his pocket. Back in his own farm, Raymond sat at Martha's desk in the corner of the kitchen, the locket spread before him on the polished wood surface where Martha had paid bills and planned gardens and written letters to their children. The photograph of Elena Vasquez seemed to watch him, her hopeful expression a stark contrast to the mystery surrounding her fate. He picked up the phone to call Sheriff Murphy, but hesitated with his finger on the dial. Once he made this call, once he set official wheels in motion, there would be no going back. This would become a case, an investigation, a disruption of the quiet life he'd been trying to rebuild since Martha's death. But as he looked at Elena's photograph, at the careful way someone had written her name and hidden it where no one was supposed to find it, Raymond knew he had no choice. Whatever had happened to Elena Vasquez in June of 1987, she deserved to have her story told. She deserved to have someone care enough to ask the questions that apparently hadn't been asked before, or hadn't been answered satisfactorily. Martha would have made the call without hesitation, Raymond realized. Martha had always believed that every person mattered, that everyone deserved to be remembered, to have their story honored. In the months before her death, when pain medication made her thoughts drift and wander, she'd often spoken about people from her past, making sure their names were spoken aloud, their contributions acknowledged. Every person's story matters, she'd told him during one of those long nights when sleep wouldn't come. That's what separates us from the animals. We remember each other. We tell the stories. We make sure no one just disappears without leaving a trace. Raymond dialed Sheriff Murphy's number, listening to the phone ring while Elena Vasquez's photograph seemed to encourage him from the desk where Martha had planned so many acts of quiet kindness. Whatever happened next, Elena's name would be spoken again, her story would be investigated. Her memory would be honored. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, and Raymond began the conversation that would change everything. Murphy speaking. The voice was gruff but warm, carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with people's troubles and had learned to project both competence and compassion in those first words of contact. Sheriff Murphy, this is Raymond Cook out on Maple Ridge Road. I'm calling about something unusual we found today, something that might be connected to an old case. There was a pause, and Raymond could hear the rustle of papers in the background, the sound of a man settling in to give full attention to an unexpected call. Raymond Cook, you're Martha's husband. I'm sorry for your loss. She was a good woman who did right by a lot of people in this valley. The acknowledgement of Martha's passing, even 2 years later, still had the power to catch Raymond off guard. But there was something comforting about the way Murphy spoke of her, as if her influence was still recognized and respected in the community. Thank you, Sheriff. This is about something we found hidden in my horse's hoof. A locket with a photograph and a name, Elena Vasquez, dated June 1987. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pause. This was the silence of recognition, of memories suddenly brought into sharp focus after years of dormancy. When Murphy spoke again, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. I remember that name. Elena Vasquez. Missing person case from '87. Never solved. Another pause. You said you found something hidden in a horse's hoof? Raymond explained the morning's discovery, describing Doc Peterson's careful examination. And the locket's hidden contents. Murphy listened without interruption, asking only brief questions for clarification. When Raymond finished, the sheriff was quiet for a long moment. I'd like to see what you found, and I'd like to talk to you about what I remember from that case. Are you free this afternoon? They arranged to meet at Murphy's house, and Raymond spent the drive trying to prepare himself for whatever he was about to learn. The sheriff lived in a modest ranch house on the edge of town, surrounded by the kind of careful landscaping that spoke of retirement time well spent. Murphy met him at the door, a man in his mid-70s, still carrying himself with the straight-backed posture of someone accustomed to authority, his white hair neatly trimmed and his handshake firm. Come in, Raymond. Coffee's fresh if you want some. Murphy's home office occupied what had probably been intended as a spare bedroom. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. But what caught Raymond's attention was the stack of cardboard boxes along one wall, each labeled with years and case numbers. Cold cases, Murphy explained, following Raymond's gaze. Cases that were never solved, families that never got answers. I keep hoping that someday new evidence will surface, or someone will remember something they didn't think was important at the time. He pulled a weathered cardboard box from the stack, its label reading 1987, unsolved. The box was heavier than its size suggested, filled with file folders that represented mysteries that had outlasted the careers of the men who'd originally investigated them. Elena Vasquez, Murphy said, pulling out a thick folder. 23 years old, Mexican national working on a seasonal agriculture permit. Reported missing by her supervisor at the Morrison farm on June 15, 1987. Raymond felt a chill at the mention of the Morrison farm. He'd driven past that property countless times, had known the Morrison family by reputation, if not personally. The idea that Elena Vasquez had been working there when she disappeared added a local dimension to the mystery. That made it feel more immediate, more real. Murphy spread the contents of the file across his desk: police reports, witness statements, photographs, and maps of the search areas. The photograph attached to the missing person report showed the same young woman Raymond had found in the locket. But this was a more formal shot, probably taken for her work permit. She looked serious in this picture, hopeful but perhaps a little apprehensive about what lay ahead. According to the file, Elena had been working at Morrison's for about 6 weeks when she disappeared. Lived in the worker housing with several other seasonal employees. Last seen the evening of June 14th by her roommate, who said Elena seemed upset about something but wouldn't say what. Murphy pointed to a witness statement in the file. The roommate, Maria Santos, said Elena had been receiving unwanted attention from someone but wouldn't identify who. Said Elena was planning to file a complaint with the farm supervisor, but wanted to gather more evidence first. Raymond studied the photographs of the search areas, noting how thoroughly the authorities had combed the surrounding countryside. Teams had searched the Morrison property, the surrounding farms, the wooded areas along the creek, even the abandoned buildings in town. But Elena Vasquez had simply vanished, leaving behind only her belongings and a growing conviction among the investigators that something terrible had happened to her. What made the case go cold? Raymond asked, noting how abruptly the file entries stopped after 6 months of investigation. Murphy's expression grew complicated, the look of a man wrestling with professional disappointment and personal regret. Politics, he said finally. The Morrison family was influential in the county, contributed heavily to political campaigns, had connections in the state capital. When the investigation started focusing on their property and their workers, pressure came down from above to wrap things up quietly. The words carried the weight of old frustration, of a younger man who'd been forced to abandon a case he believed deserved more attention. Murphy had been a deputy then, working under Sheriff Harrison, who had been nearing retirement and perhaps more susceptible to political pressure than he should have been. I never believed Elena just left town, Murphy continued. She'd been sending money to her mother in Mexico, had plans to bring her family north when she earned enough. Her personal belongings were still in her room, including her passport and the money she'd been saving. Nobody abandons their life savings and their only means of legal identification. Raymond examined a copy of Elena's work permit, noting the careful way her information had been recorded, the photograph that captured her determination to build a better life. This wasn't someone who would disappear voluntarily, not when she had family depending on her and goals she was working toward. There's something else, Murphy said, pulling out a separate folder. Elena wasn't the first. In the 3 years before her disappearance, 2 other farm workers had gone missing from properties in the valley. Different farms, different circumstances, but the same pattern: young women, here on work permits, last seen after reporting problems with harassment or unwanted attention. The revelation added a darker dimension to Elena's story, suggesting not an isolated incident but a pattern of predatory behavior that had been allowed to continue unchecked. Raymond felt a growing sense of anger, not just at the individuals who might have harmed these women, but at the system that had failed to protect them. "Why are you showing me this?" Raymond asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because you found evidence," Murphy said simply. That locket was hidden deliberately by someone who wanted to preserve Elena's memory even if they couldn't save her life. "And because I'm too old to care about politics anymore. I want to know what happened to Elena Vasquez, and I want her family to have answers." They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the weight of unfinished business and undelivered justice. Raymond understood that accepting this responsibility meant more than just satisfying curiosity. It meant committing to a search for truth that might lead to uncomfortable places and unwelcome revelations. "Where do we start?" Raymond asked, and saw something like relief flicker across Murphy's weathered features. "We start by talking to people who were there in 1987. Most of the seasonal workers have moved on, but some of the permanent employees might still be around. And we start by asking questions that maybe didn't get asked the first time, or didn't get answered honestly." Murphy closed the file but left it on the desk, a tangible reminder that Elena's case was active again after 35 years of silence. "There's someone I want us to talk to first. Carlos Mendez. He was the crew supervisor at Morrison's in 1987. Still works there as far as I know. He gave a statement back then, but I always had the feeling he knew more than he was saying." As they planned their next steps, Raymond found himself thinking about Martha, about her quiet conviction that every person's story mattered. Elena Vasquez had been someone's daughter, someone's hope for a better future. She deserved to have her story told, her fate discovered, her memory honored. The sun was setting as Raymond drove home, casting long shadows across the valley where Elena had lived and worked and disappeared. The peaceful countryside looked the same as it had that morning, but Raymond knew that beneath its serene surface lay secrets that had been buried too long. At home, he placed Elena's locket on Martha's desk next to her garden journal, 2 artifacts from different women whose lives had been cut short too soon. Tomorrow, he and Murphy would begin asking questions that had gone unasked for over 3 decades. Elena Vasquez would finally have advocates. The Morrison farm occupied some of the most fertile land in the valley, its neat rows of corn and soybeans stretching toward hills that had been worked by the same family for 4 generations. Raymond had driven past the entrance countless times, but this was the first time he turned down the long gravel drive that led to the cluster of buildings that served as the operations headquarters. Murphy rode beside him in comfortable silence, both men preparing for a conversation that might yield new insights into Elena's disappearance. The retired sheriff had brought Elena's work permit from the case file, a yellow document that would help establish her identity and legal status with anyone who might have forgotten the details after 35 years. David Morrison met them at the farmhouse door before they could knock, as if he'd been watching for their arrival. He was a man in his late 50s, carrying himself with the confidence that came from inheriting both land and reputation. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, but Raymond noticed something guarded in his expression when Murphy introduced himself and explained the reason for their visit. "Elena Vasquez." David repeated the name with what sounded like genuine puzzlement. "That was a long time ago. I'm not sure how much help I can be. I was away at college for most of 1987. Murphy nodded politely, but made a note in the small notebook he carried. "We understand this is old news, but new evidence has surfaced that might help us finally resolve her disappearance. Any information you might remember could be helpful." David invited them inside, leading them to a comfortable living room that spoke of prosperity maintained across generations. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, showing Morrison men post with prized livestock and farming equipment, the visual record of a successful agricultural dynasty. But Raymond noticed that the photos seemed to skip the late 1980s, jumping from David's high school graduation to his wedding several years later. "My father handled all the day-to-day operations back then," David explained, settling into a leather chair that had probably been his father's favorite spot. "I was focused on my studies at State. Only came home for major holidays and summer breaks." Murphy showed him Elena's work permit, pointing to the employment dates that indicated she'd worked at the Morrison farm from early May through mid-June of 1987. "According to our records, Elena was employed here when she disappeared. Do you remember anything about the seasonal workers that year?" David studied the document with apparent concentration, but Raymond noticed that his attention seemed focused more on the official stamps and signatures than on Elena's photograph. When he looked up, his expression remained carefully neutral. "Dad employed a lot of seasonal workers over the years. Hard to keep track of individuals, especially after so much time has passed. They came, they worked, they moved on to other opportunities. That was just the nature of the business." The dismissive tone bothered Raymond, though he couldn't quite articulate why. There was something about the way David Morrison spoke of the workers as if they were interchangeable parts rather than individual human beings with names and families and dreams. "We'd like to talk to some of the people who worked here in 1987, Murphy said. "Anyone who might remember Elena or have insights into her disappearance." David's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Most of the seasonal workers from that period have moved on. Different farms, different states, back to Mexico in some cases. The migrant labor force is pretty transient." But he did provide them with directions to find Carlos Mendez, who had been the crew supervisor in 1987 and still worked for the Morrison operation. Carlos was overseeing the repair of irrigation equipment in a field about half a mile from the main house, and David offered to call ahead to let him know they were coming. The drive to the field gave Raymond and Murphy a chance to survey the scope of the Morrison operation. This was serious farming, hundreds of acres under cultivation, expensive equipment maintained in pristine condition, every aspect of the operation reflecting generations of accumulated expertise and capital investment. Carlos Mendez was a man in his 60s, his hands and face bearing the weathered evidence of decades spent working outdoors. When Raymond and Murphy introduced themselves and mentioned Elena's name, his reaction was immediate and unmistakable, a combination of recognition, sadness, and something that might have been fear. "Elena," he said softly, removing his work gloves and giving the conversation the attention it deserved. "I remember her well. She was a good worker, a kind person. Her disappearance troubled me for many years." Unlike David Morrison's distant recollections, Carlos's memories of Elena were vivid and personal. He described her as conscientious and hardworking, someone who took pride in doing her job well and treated her fellow workers with respect and kindness. She'd been saving money to bring her mother from Mexico, he said, and often spoke of her plans for the future. "She was in a relationship?" Murphy asked, consulting his notes from the original investigation. Carlos nodded but glanced around nervously, as if concerned about who might overhear their conversation. Elena was careful about her personal life. The social dynamics were complicated. In those days, more complicated than they are now. When pressed for details, Carlos revealed that Elena had been receiving unwanted attention from someone with authority over the workers. She'd confided in him about the harassment, but had been reluctant to file a formal complaint, fearing it might jeopardize her work permit and her ability to earn money for her family. She was planning to speak to the authorities, Carlos said, his voice heavy with regret. She'd been documenting incidents, gathering evidence, but she wanted to be careful to make sure her complaint would be taken seriously. Murphy showed Carlos Elena's work permit, and the older man's expression grew even more troubled. She was proud of this, he said, pointing to the official documentation. Legal status meant everything to her. She'd worked hard to obtain the proper permits, followed all the regulations. She wasn't someone who would just abandon her responsibilities. As they talked, Carlos gradually revealed more details about the social environment at the Morrison farm in 1987. The Hispanic workers lived separately from the permanent employees, faced language barriers that made reporting problems difficult, and operated within a power structure that left them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Things have improved since then, Carlos said carefully. But in those days, seasonal workers had little protection if someone in authority decided to make their lives difficult. When Murphy asked directly whether Carlos knew who had been harassing Elena, the supervisor's discomfort became even more apparent. He looked around the field again, checking to make sure they were alone, before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "There were rumors," he said finally. "But rumors can be dangerous for people in my position. Elena never told me a name, and I never saw anything directly." It was clear that Carlos knew more than he was saying, but also clear that he was afraid to speak more openly. The fear was understandable. He still worked for the Morrison operation, still depended on his job for his livelihood, and had probably learned through experience that asking too many questions about powerful people could have consequences. Murphy gave Carlos his card and asked him to call if he remembered anything else, or if he decided he was willing to share more information. As they prepared to leave, Carlos made a request that surprised both men. "Elena's family," he said. "Do they know what you're investigating? Have they ever received answers about what happened to her?" Murphy explained that the family had never been contacted after the initial investigation went cold. Elena's mother had made inquiries through Mexican authorities, but the language barriers and jurisdictional complications had made it difficult to get information. "She deserves to be remembered properly," Carlos said, and Raymond heard an echo of Martha's voice in the sentiment. Elena had dreams, plans, people who loved her. She wasn't just another worker who moved on. The drive back to the main road gave Raymond and Murphy time to process what they'd learned. David Morrison's vague recollections contrasted sharply with Carlos Mendez's detailed memories of Elena as a person rather than just an employee. And Carlos's obvious reluctance to speak openly suggested that there were aspects of Elena's story that were still too dangerous to discuss, even after 35 years. "He knows something," Murphy said as they reached the highway. "But he's scared. Can't say I blame him. If someone got away with murder in 1987, they might not hesitate to silence anyone who threatens to expose them now." Raymond found himself thinking about the power dynamics Carlos had described, about the vulnerability of workers who depended on the goodwill of their employers, not just for income, but for their legal right to remain in the country. Elena had been trying to navigate a system that offered little protection for someone in her position, and her efforts to seek justice might have sealed her fate. As they drove past the Morrison farmhouse, Raymond noticed David Morrison standing at a window, watching their departure. There was something about his posture, about the intensity of his attention, that suggested their visit had been more significant than his casual responses had indicated. "What's our next step?" Raymond asked. Murphy consulted his notebook, where he'd been recording names and leads throughout their conversations. "We need to find other people who knew Elena, who might be willing to talk about what they saw or heard in 1987. And we need to look more closely at the farm's employment records from that period." They also needed to examine the physical evidence more carefully. The locket hidden in Daisy's hoof represented deliberate concealment. Someone had risked everything to preserve Elena's memory and identity. That someone might still be alive, might still have information that could finally bring closure to Elena's case. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the valley as Raymond dropped Murphy off at his house. They agreed to meet again the following morning to continue their investigation, but Raymond found himself reluctant to end the day's inquiries. For the first time since Martha's death, he felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own grief and loss at home. He sat at Martha's desk with Elena's work permit spread before him next to her locket. The official document told the story of a young woman who'd followed all the rules, obtained proper authorization, and pursued her dreams through legal channels. But the locket told a different story, one of love, hope, and ultimately tragedy that had been hidden away from official scrutiny. Raymond thought about Carlos Mendez's fear, about David Morrison's careful neutrality, about the pattern of missing women that Murphy had described. Elena's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger story about power, vulnerability, and the price some people paid for trying to build better lives. Martha would have understood the importance of continuing this investigation. Raymond realized she'd always believed that justice delayed was still justice worth pursuing, that every person deserved to have their story told and their memory honored. As evening settled over the valley, Raymond made a decision that would have made Martha proud. He would see this through, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be or how powerful the people who'd prefer it remain buried. Elena Vasquez deserved nothing less. That evening, Raymond found himself doing something he hadn't done since Martha's funeral, searching through her personal belongings with deliberate purpose rather than painful nostalgia. If Elena Vasquez had disappeared in June of 1987, and if Martha had somehow known about the case, there might be evidence of her involvement hidden among the papers and mementos she'd accumulated over 43 years of marriage. Martha had been a keeper of things: letters, newspaper clippings, church bulletins, receipts for purchases that seemed insignificant, but had mattered to her for reasons Raymond was only beginning to understand. Her desk drawers contained layers of documentation that told the story of a life lived with attention to detail and care for community connections. In the bottom drawer, beneath a collection of seed catalogs and garden planning notes, Raymond discovered Martha's Bible, the leather-bound King James Version her grandmother had given her as a wedding gift. He'd seen Martha reading it countless times over the years, but had never examined it closely. Now, opening it to the inscription page, he found something that made his breath catch. There, in Martha's careful handwriting just below her grandmother's wedding blessing, was a list of names written in pencil and apparently added over many years. Most of the names were unfamiliar, but near the bottom of the list, in handwriting that looked more recent, was written Elena Vasquez, June 1987. Raymond stared at the entry, trying to understand what it meant. Martha had known about Elena's disappearance, had considered it significant enough to record in her most precious book, but had never mentioned it to him. The discovery raised uncomfortable questions about how much of Martha's life he'd been unaware of, how many concerns she'd carried without sharing them. He called Murphy immediately, despite the late hour. "She knew," Raymond said without preamble when the sheriff answered. "Martha knew about Elena. I found Elena's name written in Martha's Bible, along with other names I don't recognize." Murphy was quiet for a moment, processing this unexpected development. Did Martha ever mention working with missing person cases? Any volunteer work that might have brought her into contact with Elena's family? Raymond admitted that he was beginning to realize how little he'd known about Martha's activities in the community. He'd been aware of her church attendance, her involvement in various charitable projects, but he'd never paid close attention to the specific nature of her volunteer work. The next morning, Raymond drove to the house of Helen Reeves, his neighbor who had been Martha's closest friend. Helen greeted him with the kind of warm concern that had become familiar since Martha's death, but her expression grew serious when Raymond explained the reason for his visit. "Martha never talked about specific cases," Helen said carefully, "but I knew she was involved with families who were looking for missing relatives. She helped with translation sometimes, made phone calls, connected people with resources they needed. Helen led Raymond to her kitchen, where coffee was always ready and conversations could unfold at their own pace. As they talked, she revealed aspects of Martha's community involvement that Raymond had never fully understood. "Your wife had a gift for languages," Helen explained. "Her Spanish wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to help families communicate with authorities who only spoke English. She spent a lot of time at the church in the evenings, working with families who needed help navigating government offices and legal procedures." The picture that emerged was of a Martha who had been far more engaged with the struggles of vulnerable community members than Raymond had realized. While he'd been focused on work and farm responsibilities, Martha had been quietly building relationships with families who faced language barriers and cultural isolation. She was especially concerned about women who went missing, Helen continued. Said it broke her heart that families could lose daughters and mothers and never get answers about what happened to them. Helen's revelation sent Raymond to the Hispanic Community Church on the south side of town, a modest building that served families who often worked the valley's farms and businesses. Pastor Williams, who had served the congregation for over 20 years, remembered Martha well. "Mrs. Cook was a blessing to our community," Pastor Williams said in slightly accented English. "She understood that language should not be a barrier to justice or compassion." The pastor led Raymond to a small office behind the sanctuary, where filing cabinets contained records of the church's community service programs. Martha's name appeared on volunteer lists dating back to the early 1980s, documenting her involvement in translation services, family assistance programs, and missing person advocacy. "Elena Vasquez," Pastor Williams said when Raymond mentioned the name. "I remember that case. Very sad. Her family came here looking for help, but the language barriers made it difficult to get information from the authorities." He explained that Martha had been one of the few Anglo volunteers who worked consistently with Hispanic families, earning their trust through patient attention to their concerns and genuine respect for their dignity. When families faced crises, missing relatives, legal problems, workplace disputes, Martha was often one of the first people they contacted for help. Elena's disappearance was especially troubling because she was such a devout young woman, Pastor Williams continued. She attended services here regularly, participated in our young adult Bible study. When she disappeared, her friends were convinced something terrible had happened. The pastor pulled out a folder containing correspondence from that period, letters to and from Mexican authorities, copies of missing person reports, documentation of search efforts that had been organized by the Hispanic community when official investigations stalled. "Mrs. Cook tried to organize search parties," Pastor Williams explained. "She contacted other churches, tried to get volunteer groups involved. But she was discouraged by local authorities who said the searches were unnecessary, that Elena had probably just moved on to another job." Raymond studied copies of letters Martha had written to various officials, her careful prose advocating for continued investigation and family notification. The letters revealed a side of his wife he'd never fully appreciated, a woman willing to challenge authority when she believed justice was being denied. "Why didn't she tell me about this?" Raymond asked, though he wasn't sure Pastor Williams could answer such a personal question. The pastor's expression grew gentle, understanding. "Perhaps she wanted to protect you from worry. Or perhaps she understood that you were busy with your own responsibilities. Many spouses keep separate spheres of activity, especially when the work involves heartbreak that might be difficult to share." As Raymond prepared to leave, Pastor Williams made a suggestion that surprised him. Elena's family never stopped looking for answers. Her mother passed away 5 years ago, but Elena had a sister who still lives in Mexico. She writes to me occasionally, asking if there has been any news. The idea of contacting Elena's family directly was both appealing and daunting. It would mean taking responsibility not just for investigating Elena's disappearance, but for managing the hopes and expectations of people who had been waiting 35 years for news of their daughter and sister. But it was what Martha would have done. Raymond realized. Martha had never turned away from difficult conversations or painful responsibilities when they involved helping other people find peace. Driving home through the valley where Elena had lived and worked and disappeared, Raymond understood that. His wife's Bible entry represented more than just record-keeping. It was evidence of a commitment to memory, a refusal to let Elena's name be forgotten even when official investigations had failed. Martha had carried Elena's story in her heart for over 30 years, and now it was Raymond's turn to carry it forward. The weight of that responsibility felt both heavy and right, like inheriting a task that connected him to the best parts of Martha's character and values at home. He placed Martha's Bible on the desk next to Elena's locket, two artifacts that together told a story of compassion that transcended cultural boundaries and official indifference. Tomorrow, he and Murphy would continue their investigation with new understanding of how many people had cared about Elena's fate, even when their efforts had been dismissed or discouraged. Elena Vasquez had not been forgotten, even in her absence. And now, finally, she might have advocates with enough determination and resources to uncover the truth about what had happened to her on that June night in 1987. The next morning brought Raymond back to the Hispanic Community Church, this time accompanied by Murphy, and armed with a better understanding of Elena's connections to the local community. Pastor Williams had spent the evening contacting elderly parishioners who might remember Elena, and by the time Raymond and Murphy arrived, several people had gathered in the church's fellowship hall. The gathering included 3 women and 2 men, all now in their 60s or 70s, who had known Elena during her brief time in the valley. Their memories of her were warm and detailed. They remembered her laugh, her dedication to sending money home to Mexico, her excitement about bringing her mother north to live with her. Elena was planning to get married, said Rosa Martinez, a woman who had lived in the worker housing with Elena. She was so happy, talking about the wedding she would have when her novio saved enough money to support a family. The revelation of Elena's engagement plans added another layer to the mystery. According to Rosa, Elena had been secretive about her fiance's identity, saying only that he was a good man who worked hard and treated her with respect. She'd been planning to announce their engagement formally after he spoke with her family. In Mexico, she was saving for a wedding dress, Rosa continued, her eyes filling with tears at the memory. Every week, she put aside a little money. She showed us pictures in a catalog of the dress she wanted to buy. Murphy took careful notes as the group shared their recollections, building a picture of Elena as a young woman with concrete plans for the future, not someone who would disappear voluntarily. But when he asked about the harassment Elena had mentioned to Carlos Mendez, the conversation became more guarded. It was Father Rodriguez, Pastor Williams's predecessor, who had since retired, who finally addressed the uncomfortable topic. He was a man in his 80s now, his Spanish accented English careful but clear. Elena came to me for confession 3 weeks before she disappeared, Father Rodriguez said quietly. She was troubled about something, frightened. She said someone in authority was making demands of her, threatening her job and her legal status if she didn't comply with his wishes. The priest's revelation electrified the room. This was the most specific information they'd received about Elena's situation in the weeks before her disappearance, and it corroborated Carlos Mendez's vague references to harassment from someone with power over the workers. Did she name this person? Murphy asked gently, understanding the delicate nature of confessional information. Father Rodriguez shook his head. She spoke only in general terms, but her fear was real. She asked me to pray for guidance, for strength to resist temptation, and for protection from evil. The priest paused, clearly struggling with how much he could reveal while respecting the sanctity of confession. I encouraged her to speak with authorities, to seek help from people who could protect her, but she was afraid her complaints would not be believed, that she would be blamed for encouraging the attention. As the morning continued, the group shared other memories that helped fill in details of Elena's life in the valley. She had attended English classes at the church, participated in a young adults Bible study, and helped organize community celebrations that brought together workers from different farms. It was during a discussion of these celebrations that Rosa Martinez mentioned something that made Murphy sit up straighter. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into the church office and returning with a photo album that documented community events from the 1980s. The album contained dozens of pictures from church picnics, holiday celebrations, and community gatherings. Most of the photos show groups of Hispanic families and young workers, smiling and relaxed in their Sunday clothes. But it was a picture from a May 1987 celebration that caught everyone's attention. The photograph showed Elena at a community barbecue, standing with a group of other young women near a table laden with food. She was smiling, looking happy and comfortable among her friends. But what drew Murphy's attention was that someone had deliberately scratched out the face of a man standing in the background of the photo. "Who is that?" Murphy asked, pointing to the damaged area of the photograph. The elderly parishioners examined the picture carefully, but the scratching had been so thorough that identification was impossible. However, several people remembered that the photograph had been defaced sometime after Elena's disappearance, when the album was being prepared for display during a memorial service. "Someone didn't want that person to be recognized," Rosa said, thoughtfully. "But I can't remember who it was or why they were important." Murphy asked to borrow the photograph, promising to return it after having it examined by experts who might be able to reveal the scratched-out image. The deliberate defacement suggested that someone had considered the man's presence in the photo to be significant, perhaps incriminating. As the gathering began to break up, Father Rodriguez pulled Raymond aside for a private conversation. "Mrs. Cook was very interested in Elena's case," the priest said quietly. "She came here many times, asking questions, trying to help Elena's family get information from the authorities." The priest led Raymond to a small memorial garden behind the church, where a simple wooden cross marked a space set aside for remembering missing community members. Elena's name was carved into the base of the cross, along with several other names that represented the valley's unresolved disappearances. "Your wife helped us create this memorial," Father Rodriguez explained. "She believed that even when people are missing, their memories should be honored and their stories should be told." Raymond stood before the memorial cross, understanding for the first time the depth of Martha's commitment to Elena's memory. This wasn't just volunteer work or community service. It was a personal mission to ensure that vulnerable people weren't forgotten when official systems failed them. "Elena's sister still writes to me," Father Rodriguez continued. "Carmen Vasquez. She lives in Guadalajara now, has children of her own, but she has never stopped hoping for news about Elena. Each letter asks the same question: have you learned anything about what happened to my sister?" The priest's words carried the weight of decades of unanswered questions and undelivered closure. Raymond realized that solving Elena's case would mean more than just satisfying his own curiosity or honoring Martha's memory. It would mean providing peace to a family that had been living with uncertainty for 35 years. As they prepared to leave the church, Murphy made arrangements to have the damaged photograph analyzed and to interview additional community members who might have information about Elena's final weeks. But Raymond found himself thinking about the broader implications of what they were uncovering. Elena's story was becoming a window into the social dynamics of the valley in the 1980s, when vulnerable workers had little protection from exploitation and abuse. The pattern of missing women that Murphy had mentioned suggested systematic predatory behavior that had been allowed to continue because the victims were politically powerless and culturally isolated. The drive back through town took them past the Morrison farm again, and Raymond noticed Murphy studying the property with renewed interest. The scratched-out photograph, Elena's references to harassment from someone in authority, and the family's political influence in the county were beginning to form a pattern that pointed toward uncomfortable conclusions. "We're getting close to something," Murphy said as they reached Raymond's farm. "Someone powerful enough to make people afraid, someone connected to that photo. The question is whether we can prove it after all these years." That evening, Raymond sat with Martha's Bible and Elena's locket, thinking about the courage it had taken for Elena to resist harassment and threats, to plan for a future that included marriage and family despite the dangers she faced. Her story was becoming personal to him now, not just because of Martha's involvement, but because of his growing understanding of the injustice she had suffered. Someone had killed Elena Vasquez to silence her, had hidden her body to avoid consequences, and had lived freely for 35 years while her family grieved without answers. But Elena had found a way to preserve her identity and memory, hiding her locket where someone would eventually find it and ask the right questions. Tomorrow, Raymond and Murphy would continue following the trail Elena had left behind. And somewhere in Mexico, Carmen Vasquez would continue waiting for news about her sister, not knowing that finally, someone was listening to Elena's voice calling out from the silence. Murphy's phone call came early the next morning, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately caught Raymond's attention. "I found something," Murphy said without preamble. "Can you meet me at the library in town? There's something you need to see about David Morrison's story." The Millbrook Public Library occupied a Carnegie building that had served the community for over a century, its reading rooms quiet sanctuaries where local history was preserved in bound volumes and archived newspapers. Murphy was waiting at a corner table surrounded by yearbooks and what appeared to be official documents. "Remember how David Morrison said he was away at college during 1987? Murphy asked as Raymond joined him. "I decided to check that claim." Murphy opened a folder containing correspondence from the registrar's office at State University. The official records showed that David Morrison had been enrolled as a junior in the agricultural business program during the 1986-87 academic year. But the details revealed something significant that contradicted his account. "Look at this," Murphy said, pointing to a transcript notation. David Morrison took a leave of absence in March 1987. Didn't return to classes until the fall semester. The documentation was clear and official. David Morrison had been absent from university for the entire period when Elena disappeared, directly contradicting his claim about being away at college. But Murphy had discovered something even more troubling in the university archives. "Here's his college yearbook from 1987, Murphy said, opening a leather-bound volume to a page he'd marked with a strip of paper. "Look at the spring semester activities section." The yearbook page showed photographs from various campus events, but one image made Raymond's breath catch. It was a group photo from a spring agriculture club meeting, clearly labeled with a date. In April 1987. And there, standing in the back row with a confident smile, was a young David Morrison. But the most damning evidence was in the photo's caption, which identified the location. "Agriculture Club members visit Morrison Family Farm, Millbrook Valley, April 18, 1987. He wasn't away at college," Raymond said, stating the obvious conclusion. "He was home, bringing college friends to tour the family operation." Murphy nodded grimly. "And that's not all. I contacted the county clerk's office to check arrest records from that period. Guess whose name shows up in June 1987? He produced a copy of an arrest report dated June 20th, 1987, 5 days after Elena's disappearance was reported. David Morrison had been arrested for assault and battery, charges that were dropped 3 days later when the complainant withdrew her statement. The victim was listed as Maria Santos, Murphy continued. Elena's roommate, the same woman who reported Elena missing. The pattern was becoming clear, and it painted a disturbing picture of David Morrison's behavior in the weeks surrounding Elena's disappearance. He had been present in the valley, not away at college as he'd claimed. He'd been arrested for assaulting Elena's roommate shortly after Elena went missing, and the charges had been dropped under circumstances that suggested pressure or intimidation. "We need to confront him with this evidence," Raymond said, feeling anger building at the deliberate deception they'd been fed. But Murphy shook his head. "Not yet. If David Morrison killed Elena, confronting him prematurely could drive him to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. We need to build a stronger case first." They spent the rest of the morning at the library, researching newspaper archives from 1987. The Millbrook Weekly had covered Elena's disappearance with a brief article that treated it as a routine missing person case. But Murphy noticed what wasn't in the coverage. No mention of the assault charges against David Morrison. No indication that the investigation had focused on the Morrison farm. Small-town newspaper, dependent on local business advertising, Murphy observed. The Morrison family had influence over what got reported and what got buried. But it was Raymond who made the connection that changed everything. As they prepared to leave the library, he noticed a display case containing historical photographs of the valley's farming families. One section featured the Morrison operation through the decades, including several photos from the 1980s. "Look at this," Raymond said, calling Murphy's attention to a 1986 photograph showing the Morrison farm's seasonal worker housing. The buildings in the picture were clearly different from the structures they'd seen during their visit to the farm. Murphy studied the photograph carefully. David Morrison said the worker housing had been demolished and rebuilt since Elena's time. This shows what the original buildings looked like. They asked the librarian for help accessing more historical photos from the Morrison farm, and what they discovered was revelatory. The seasonal worker housing visible in photos from the 1980s had been demolished sometime in the early 1990s, replaced by newer structures built in a completely different location on the property. Why would you demolish perfectly functional buildings and rebuild somewhere else? Raymond asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Murphy's expression was grim. Because something happened in those buildings that you wanted to make sure was never discovered. If Elena was killed at the farm, destroying the crime scene would eliminate evidence. The revelation transformed their understanding of David Morrison, from a peripheral figure who might have information about Elena's disappearance to the primary suspect in her murder. His lies about being at college, his arrest for assaulting Elena's roommate, and the destruction of the worker housing all pointed toward a deliberate cover-up that had been planned and executed with the resources and influence of a wealthy farming family. "There's something else," Murphy said, pulling out his notebook to review information from their previous interviews. "Remember how Carlos Mendez seemed afraid to name the person who had been harassing Elena? He's worked for the Morrison family for over 30 years. If David Morrison was the harasser, Carlos would have every reason to be afraid of speaking openly." They needed to find Carlos again, Raymond realized, but this time they needed to approach him away from the Morrison farm, somewhere he might feel safer about revealing what he knew. And they needed to do it quickly, before David Morrison realized how much evidence was accumulating against him. As they left the library, Murphy's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from the county sheriff's office, and Murphy's side of the conversation suggested official interest in their investigation. "That was Sheriff Brennan," Murphy explained after ending the call. "Someone contacted his office this morning, claiming that private citizens were harassing the Morrison family with questions about old resolved cases." The timing of the complaint was suspicious, coming just one day after their visit to the Morrison farm. David Morrison was clearly concerned about their investigation and was using his family's political connections to try to shut it down. What? Did you tell Brennan? Raymond asked. The truth. That we're investigating new evidence in an unsolved missing person case. I showed him the locket and explained how we found it. He's agreed to give us some time to develop our leads, but he wants regular updates. The official scrutiny added pressure to their investigation, but it also provided some protection. If something happened to Raymond or Murphy now, the sheriff's office would know to look closely at David. Morrison and his family's reaction to their inquiries died as they drove back toward Raymond's farm. Both men were quiet, processing the implications of what they'd discovered. David Morrison hadn't just lied to them about his whereabouts in 1987. He'd constructed an elaborate deception designed to distance himself from Elena's disappearance. That level of premeditation suggested not just guilt, but confidence that his family's influence would protect him from consequences. We're going to need more than circumstantial evidence, Murphy said finally. We need to find Elena's body, or we need someone willing to testify about what they saw or heard. Raymond nodded, understanding that they'd reached a crucial point in their investigation. They had uncovered enough evidence to identify David Morrison as their primary suspect, but proving his guilt would require taking risks that could put them in danger. Elena Vasquez had been silenced for 35 years, but her voice was finally being heard. The question now was whether justice could be delivered before those responsible for her death realized how close the truth was to being exposed. The anonymous phone call came at midnight, jarring Raymond from sleep with its insistent ringing. When he answered, expecting perhaps a medical emergency or family crisis, he heard instead a voice speaking rapid Spanish, then switching to heavily accented English. Senator Cook, this is Carlos Mendez. I cannot talk long, but I must speak with you. Can you meet me tomorrow before dawn at the old cemetery on Ridge Road? Come alone, please. It is not safe for me to be seen talking to you. The line went dead before Raymond could ask questions, leaving him staring at the phone in the darkness of his bedroom. Carlos Mendez's voice had carried fear and urgency, but also a determination that suggested he'd finally decided to risk telling the truth about Elena's disappearance. Raymond called Murphy immediately, despite the late hour. The retired sheriff listened to the account of Carlos's call with growing concern about both the opportunity it represented and the dangers it might pose. He's scared, Murphy said, but he's also been carrying this secret for 35 years. Maybe the pressure is finally too much. They agreed to meet at Raymond's farm before dawn, then approached the cemetery together despite Carlos's request that Raymond come alone. Neither man felt comfortable with the isolation of the meeting place or the obvious fear in Carlos's voice. The Ridge Road cemetery occupied a hillside overlooking the valley, its weathered headstones marking the resting places of farming families who had worked the land for generations. As Raymond and Murphy arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, they could see a solitary figure waiting near the old section, where markers from the 1800s tilted at angles determined by time and settling earth. Carlos Mendez looked older than he had just days earlier, as if the decision to finally speak the truth had aged him years in a matter of hours. He greeted them with nervous handshakes and immediately led them to a spot shielded from view of the road by a stand of oak trees. I have been afraid for 35 years, Carlos began without preamble. Afraid of losing my job, afraid for my family's safety, afraid of what might happen if I told what I saw that night. His voice carried the weight of decades of suppressed guilt and fear, but also a kind of relief that suggested the burden of silence had become unbearable. As he began to tell his story, Raymond and Murphy understood why he had been too frightened to speak openly before. Elena came to my house the night she disappeared, Carlos continued. She was crying, very upset. She said David Morrison had cornered her in the equipment barn, had tried to force himself on her. When she resisted, he became angry. threatened to have her deported if she caused trouble for him. The account confirmed their suspicions about David Morrison's behavior, but Carlos had more to reveal. Elena had shown him bruises on her arms where David had grabbed her, and she told him this wasn't the first incident. The harassment had been escalating for weeks. Elena had been documenting everything, Carlos explained. She kept a journal, wrote down dates and times, described what David said and did. She was planning to take it to the immigration authorities to file a formal complaint. But Elena's plan to seek official help had been discovered. Carlos had overheard David Morrison on the phone that evening, talking to someone about the Mexican girl who was causing problems and needed to be dealt with quietly. I followed Elena when she left my house, Carlos admitted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I was worried about her safety, wanted to make sure she got back to the worker housing without trouble. What Carlos had witnessed from a distance that night had haunted him for over 3 decades. Elena had been intercepted by David Morrison as she walked back to her dormitory. There had been an argument, raised voices. Then Elena had fallen to the ground and hadn't gotten up again. I was too far away to help, too afraid to call out, Carlos said, tears streaming down his weathered face. David Morrison put Elena in his truck and drove toward the back section of the farm. I never saw her again. Murphy asked why Carlos hadn't reported what he'd seen to the authorities during the original investigation. The answer revealed the complex power dynamics that had allowed David Morrison to escape consequences for 35 years. The sheriff in 1987 was Harrison, Carlos explained. He was friends with the Morrison family, owed his election to their support. When I tried to tell him what I saw, he threatened to have me arrested for making false accusations against prominent citizens. Sheriff Harrison had made it clear that any worker who caused trouble for the Morrison family would face deportation, regardless of their legal status. The threat had been effective, not just in silencing Carlos, but in ensuring that other potential witnesses remained quiet as well. There's more, Carlos said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a small metal container. After Elena disappeared, I went to the worker housing to look for her belongings. I found this hidden in her room, buried under loose floorboards. The container was a tobacco tin, its surface rusted but still intact. Inside, wrapped in plastic that had protected it from moisture for decades, was a small notebook, Elena's hidden journal. Murphy opened the journal with trembling hands, using his flashlight to illuminate pages filled with Elena's careful handwriting. The entries began in early May 1987 and documented a pattern of escalating harassment that painted David Morrison as a predator who used his position of authority to terrorize vulnerable workers. May 15th, Murphy read aloud from one of the early entries. David Morrison cornered me in the storage shed today. Said I was pretty for a Mexican girl and that he could help me get better work if I was friendly to him. I told him I wasn't interested, but he laughed and said I didn't have a choice. The entries grew more disturbing as the weeks progressed. David Morrison had begun following Elena, showing up wherever she was working, making increasingly explicit demands and threats. When Elena tried to avoid him, he retaliated by giving her the most difficult and dangerous assignments. June 10th, Murphy continued reading. David Morrison grabbed my arm today and said if I don't meet him tonight, he'll call immigration and tell them I'm working illegally. I showed him my permit, but he said permits can be revoked. I'm scared, but I won't let him hurt me. The final entry was dated June 14th, 1987, the day before Elena's disappearance. Her handwriting was shaky, suggesting she was writing under extreme stress. David Morrison tried to force himself on me in the equipment barn today. I fought him off, but he's angry now. He said no one will believe a Mexican girl over an American, that his family owns this valley and can make people disappear. I'm going to take this journal to the authorities tomorrow. If something happens to me, I want people to know the truth about David Morrison. Carlos revealed that he had kept Elena's journal hidden for 35 years, afraid to turn it over to authorities, but unable to destroy what might be the only evidence of what had really happened to her. The weight of carrying Elena's final words, her desperate attempt to document the truth about her harassment and murder, had finally become too much to bear. "There's something else," Carlos said, his voice barely audible in the pre-dawn darkness. "I know where David Morrison took Elena that night." He described a remote section of the Morrison farm, an area near the old quarry where limestone had been extracted decades earlier. The quarry had been abandoned since the 1960s, filled with water and surrounded by thick woods that made it invisible from the road or the main farm buildings. David Morrison used to take his friends there in high school, Carlos explained, to drink beer, to party where his parents wouldn't find them. If he needed to hide something permanently, that's where he would go. Murphy and Raymond exchanged glances, understanding that they now had both motive and opportunity documented in Elena's own words, and a potential location where her remains might be found. But they also understood that Carlos had placed himself in significant danger by finally revealing what he knew. "You need to leave town," Murphy told Carlos bluntly. "Go stay with relatives. Get away from the Morrison farm until we can arrest David Morrison. If he realizes you've talked to us, your life could be in danger." Carlos nodded, having already reached the same conclusion. He'd made arrangements to stay with a cousin in another state, at least until the investigation was resolved. Before leaving, he gave Murphy detailed directions to the quarry location and descriptions of landmarks that would help guide a search. As the sun began to rise over the valley, the three men stood in the cemetery surrounded by the graves of people who had lived and died in this community across 2 centuries. Elena Vasquez wasn't buried here. Her body lay hidden somewhere in the landscape below, but her voice was finally being heard through the journal she'd risked everything to preserve. "We need to contact the state police," Murphy said as they prepared to leave. "This is beyond what local authorities can handle, especially given the political influence the Morrison family still wields." Raymond understood that they were approaching the climax of their investigation, the point where Elena's story would either find justice or be buried again by the same forces that had silenced her 35 years earlier. The evidence they'd gathered, the locket, the journal. Carlos's eyewitness testimony was compelling but would mean nothing if David Morrison learned about it in time to destroy physical evidence or intimidate witnesses. The drive back to town took them past the Morrison farm one final time. The property looked peaceful in the morning light, its prosperous fields and well-maintained buildings giving no hint of the dark secrets it contained. But Raymond found himself studying the landscape with new eyes, wondering how many other stories of exploitation and violence lay buried beneath the valley's serene surface. At home, he sat with Elena's journal and her locket spread before him on Martha's desk. The journal entries revealed not just the circumstances of Elena's death, but the courage she'd shown in documenting the truth, even when she knew it might cost her life. She'd understood that her words might be the only way to achieve justice, the only way to ensure that David Morrison faced consequences for his crimes. Martha's Bible lay open beside Elena's belongings, and Raymond found himself thinking about the connections between the two women. One who had tried to help Elena find justice while she was alive, and another who had preserved the evidence needed to deliver that justice decades later. Murphy's phone calls to state authorities would set in motion the final phase of their investigation. Within hours, search teams would be combing the quarry area Carlos had described. Forensic experts would be examining Elena's journal and locket, and arrest warrants would be prepared for David Morrison. But Raymond also understood that they were racing against time. David Morrison's complaint to the sheriff's office showed that he was aware of their investigation and concerned about its direction. Once he learned that Carlos had talked to them, once he realized how much evidence had survived, he would know that his 35 years of freedom were about to end. Elena Vasquez had waited too long for justice, but her patience was about to be rewarded. Her voice, preserved in careful handwriting and hidden in a horse's hoof, was finally strong enough to reach across the decades and demand accountability from the man who had silenced her. The morning sun climbed higher over the valley, illuminating the landscape where Elena had lived and loved and dreamed of a future that had been stolen from her. But today, for the first time in 35 years, that future included the possibility of justice. The state police arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, their unmarked cars pulling into Raymond's driveway with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood the gravity of what they were investigating. Detective Sarah Chun, a specialist in cold cases and missing persons, reviewed Elena's journal and locket with the careful attention of someone who had seen too many cases where evidence had been lost or corrupted by time. "This is remarkable," Detective Chun said after studying Elena's final entries. "We rarely get this level of documentation from victims, especially in cases this old. Her own words make the case for us." Its District Attorney Michael Roberts had driven down from the state capitol specifically to oversee the investigation. At 55, he was a career prosecutor who had built his reputation on taking difficult cases that local authorities were reluctant to pursue. The combination of Elena's journal, Carlos's eyewitness testimony, and David Morrison's documented lies created what Roberts called a prosecutable case after 35 years of injustice. "We'll need to move quickly," Roberts explained as the team gathered in Raymond's kitchen. "If Morrison realizes how much evidence has surfaced, he might try to flee or destroy additional evidence. We're going to execute search warrants simultaneously at the Morrison farm and David Morrison's residence." The plan was comprehensive and carefully coordinated. While one team searched for Elena's remains in the quarry area Carlos had described, another team would examine the Morrison farm's records and interview current employees. David Morrison would be arrested at his home, preventing him from interfering with the search or contacting potential accomplices. Raymond felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as he watched the law enforcement professionals prepare for what might be the final chapter in Elena's story. After weeks of amateur investigation driven by moral obligation and community connections, the case was now in the hands of people with the resources and authority to deliver justice. "You've done excellent work," Detective Chen told Raymond as they prepared to leave for the Morrison farm. "Without your persistence and courage, Elena's case would have remained buried forever." The Morrison farm looked different when approached by a convoy of police vehicles. The property that had seemed peaceful and prosperous during Raymond's earlier visits now felt ominous, its isolation and size working against rather than for the family that had controlled it for generations. Carlos had provided detailed directions to the quarry, describing a dirt road that branched off from the main farm access and wound through woods to the abandoned limestone pit. The search team included forensic specialists, cadaver dogs, and ground-penetrating radar equipment that could detect disturbances in soil composition that might indicate buried remains. Raymond and Murphy were allowed to observe from a distance. As the search began, the quarry was larger than Raymond had expected, its water-filled pit surrounded by steep limestone walls and dense vegetation that had grown wild over the decades since mining operations ceased. It was indeed an isolated location where someone could dispose of evidence without fear of discovery. The cadaver dogs began their work systematically, covering the area around the quarry in expanding circles while their handlers watched for signs of alerting behavior. It was methodical, patient work that required expertise Raymond had never imagined needing. It was one of the German shepherds, a dog named Rex, who made the first significant discovery. About 50 yards from the quarry's edge, in an area where the ground showed subtle signs of having been disturbed decades earlier, Rex began exhibiting the focused behavior that indicated the presence of human remains. "We've got something," the handler called to Detective Chung. And within minutes, the area was cordoned off for careful excavation. The forensic team worked with archaeological precision, removing soil layer by layer and documenting everything with photographs and measurements. As they worked, other teams continued searching the surrounding area for additional evidence or burial sites. It was Raymond who spotted the glint of metal in the soil as the excavation deepened. "There," he said, pointing to something that caught the afternoon sunlight. Something silver. The forensic specialist carefully extracted the object with tools designed to preserve evidence integrity. It was a necklace, a simple silver cross on a delicate chain, tarnished by decades in the earth, but still recognizable. "Elena's cross," Raymond said quietly, remembering the description Father Rodriguez had given of the necklace Elena wore to church services. She was wearing it in some of the photographs. The discovery of Elena's necklace confirmed that they were excavating the right location, but it also meant they were uncovering Elena's remains, the physical evidence that would transform their investigation from missing person case to murder. Prosecution. As the afternoon progressed, the excavation revealed more evidence of Elena's final resting place. Fragments of clothing, personal effects, and finally, the unmistakable outline of human skeletal remains told the story of a young woman who had been buried hastily and in secret 35 years earlier. Detective Chun coordinated the careful removal and documentation of Elena's remains, treating the excavation with the respect due to both the evidence and the person Elena had been. Each bone, each fragment of clothing, each personal item was cataloged and preserved as part of the case against David Morrison. Meanwhile, the second search team was executing their warrant at David Morrison's residence. Raymond learned later that Morrison had been arrested without incident, his shock at seeing police officers at his door apparently genuine, suggesting he hadn't realized how close the investigation had come to exposing his crime. The arrest warrant was based on Elena's journal entries documenting Morrison's harassment and threats, Carlos's eyewitness testimony about the night Elena disappeared, and the physical evidence found at the burial site. After 35 years of freedom, David Morrison was finally facing charges for Elena's murder. As the sun began to set over the valley, Raymond stood with Murphy and Detective Chen at the edge of the quarry where Elena's body had been hidden for over 3 decades. The excavation was complete. Elena's remains had been carefully removed for forensic examination, and the evidence needed to prosecute her killer had been secured. "Elena can finally rest in peace," Murphy said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a lawman who had never forgotten an unsolved case. "And her family can finally have answers." Detective Chun was already making arrangements to contact Elena's sister Carmen in Mexico to deliver the news that the family had been waiting 35 years to receive. Elena's body would be released to the family for proper burial once the forensic examination was complete and the evidence had been processed for trial. The drive back to town took Raymond past landscapes that looked the same as they had that morning, but felt fundamentally different now that Elena's story was finally being told. Justice had been delayed for far too long, but it was finally within reach. At home that evening, Raymond sat at Martha's desk with Elena's locket and a copy of her journal, understanding that his role in Elena's story was mostly complete. He had been the catalyst that brought her case back to light, but now the professionals would take over. Prosecutors would build their case. Elena's family would finally receive closure, and David Morrison would face the consequences he had avoided for 35 years. The evening news carried the story of David Morrison's arrest, though the reporters had only basic details about the charges and the discovery of remains on the Morrison property. By morning, Raymond knew the full scope of Elena's story would begin to emerge as prosecutors filed their case and the evidence became part of the public record. Carlos Mendez had called from his cousin's house to express relief that the truth was finally being told. "I should have spoken sooner," he told Raymond, his voice heavy with decades of regret. Elena deserved justice 35 years ago. Raymond understood Carlos's guilt, but he also understood the fear that had kept him silent for so long. The power dynamics that had protected David Morrison in 1987 had been real and dangerous, and speaking out against a wealthy, politically connected family could have destroyed Carlos's life and endangered his family. "You spoke when it mattered," Raymond told him. "Elena's story is being told because you found the courage to break your silence. That's what she would have wanted." As the evening settled into night, Raymond found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If Doc Peterson hadn't been so thorough in examining Daisy's hooves, Elena's locket might never have been discovered. If Martha hadn't spent years working with Hispanic families and recording Elena's name in her Bible, Raymond might not have understood the personal significance of the case. But most importantly, if Elena hadn't had the courage to document David Morrison's harassment and hide her journal where Carlos could find it, there would have been no evidence to support their investigation. Elena had essentially solved her own case, preserving the proof needed to convict her killer, even though she knew it might cost her life. Martha would have been proud, Raymond realized. She had spent years trying to help Elena's family find answers, and now those answers were finally available. Elena Vasquez would be remembered not just as a victim, but as a young woman whose courage in documenting the truth had ultimately delivered justice, even from beyond the grave. The letter arrived 3 weeks later, written in both Spanish and carefully translated English, bearing the return address of Carmen Vasquez in Guadalajara, Mexico. Raymond held it with trembling hands, understanding that it represented the completion of a circle that had begun with Elena's disappearance 35 years earlier. "Senator Cook," the letter began, "I cannot find words to express my gratitude for what you have done for my family. For 35 years, we have lived with the pain of not knowing what happened to my sister Elena." Carmen's words carried the weight of decades of uncertainty, of a family forced to grieve without closure. The letter described Elena as Raymond had imagined her intelligent, determined, full of dreams for the future and love for her family. Elena was going to be a teacher, Carmen wrote. She had been accepted to university in Mexico City for fall 1987. The work in your valley was to earn tuition money and help support our mother. Detective Chun had contacted Carmen personally to inform her about Elena's remains and David Morrison's arrest. The conversation had been difficult but healing for a family that had imagined every scenario except the truth. "Elena's body will come home to us," Carmen continued. "After 35 years, we will finally lay her to rest beside our mother, who never stopped believing Elena would return." The letter included photographs Raymond had wanted to see, pictures from Elena's childhood, graduation, family celebrations where Elena's smile radiated hope and joy. Looking at these images, Raymond understood the magnitude of what had been stolen from Elena and her family. Carmen had also enclosed a letter in Elena's handwriting, dated weeks before her departure for America. Elena described her excitement about earning university money, her plans to study education and return to Mexico as a teacher, her dreams of helping poor children. "I will work hard in America," Elena had written, "and remember always that I represent our family's hopes. I will not disappoint you. I will return with enough money to build a better future for all of us." David Morrison's confession had come during plea negotiations, when his lawyers realized the evidence made a trial unwinnable. He admitted to killing Elena after she threatened to report his harassment, described burying her body at the quarry, and acknowledged destroying evidence to cover up his crime. The confession provided final closure to Elena's case, but also revealed the calculated nature of Morrison's crime. He had killed Elena to silence her, then used his family's influence to escape consequences. For 35 years, he lived freely while Elena's family suffered uncertainty. "The man who killed Elena will spend life in prison," Carmen's letter concluded. "This gives us peace, but more importantly, it gives Elena justice. She was brave enough to document the truth, brave enough to fight for her dignity, even when it cost her life. The memorial service for Elena was held at the Hispanic Community Church, where Father Rodriguez conducted a bilingual ceremony honoring Elena's faith and memory. Carmen had traveled from Mexico to attend, bringing Elena's favorite dress, the one she had planned to wear for university graduation. Raymond spoke at the service, describing how Elena's courage in documenting her harassment had ultimately delivered the justice she deserved. He read from her journal entries, allowing Elena's own words to tell her story of determination and faith. Elena Vasquez represents everyone who has been forgotten by systems that should have protected them, Raymond said. But she also represents the power of truth to survive even when those who speak it are silenced. Carlos Mendez attended the service, his decision to finally speak having freed him from decades of guilt and fear. He approached Carmen after the ceremony to offer condolences and apologies for not speaking sooner. Elena would forgive you, Carmen told him, embracing the man who had preserved her sister's journal for 35 years. She would understand your fear, and she would be grateful that you finally found the courage to tell her story. As the service concluded and the community gathered to share memories, Raymond understood that Elena's story had become larger than her individual tragedy. Elena Vasquez had become a symbol of resilience, courage, and the importance of never giving up on justice, no matter how long it takes to achieve. 6 months after David Morrison's sentencing to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Raymond stood in what had once been Martha's vegetable garden, watching as volunteers from the Hispanic Community Church carefully planted the flowers that would transform the space into Elena's memorial garden. The design had been Carmen's idea, inspired by letters Elena had written home describing the beautiful flowers she'd seen growing in American gardens. Marigolds and zinnias, chosen for their vibrant colors and their significance in Mexican culture, would bloom alongside the roses and lilacs that Martha had loved. At the garden center, a simple wooden bench bore a brass plaque with Elena's name and the dates of her birth and death, finally marking her place in the world she had hoped to make her home. Elena's mother had passed away 3 years before the truth about her daughter's fate was discovered, but Carmen had brought soil from their family's garden in Mexico to mix with the earth where Elena would be remembered. The symbolic joining of two countries, two families, two stories of love and loss felt right to Raymond in ways that transcended language and culture. She would have loved this, Carmen said, kneeling beside the newly planted marigolds that would bloom in brilliant orange and yellow throughout the summer. Elena always said that flowers were proof that beauty could grow anywhere, even in the hardest soil. The memorial garden represented more than just remembrance. It had become a gathering place for the community's Hispanic families, a space where children could play while their parents shared stories and supported each other through the challenges of building new lives in a foreign country. Elena's legacy had grown beyond her individual story to encompass the broader struggles and dreams of people seeking opportunity and dignity in America. Raymond's own children, David and Susan, had traveled from Portland and Chicago for the garden dedication ceremony. They stood with their father as Pastor Williams blessed the memorial space, their faces reflecting pride in their father's transformation from grief-stricken widower to community advocate. "Mom would be so proud of you," Susan said, linking her arm through Raymond's as they watched families arrive for the dedication. She always said that the measure of a person's life wasn't what they achieved for themselves, but what they did to help others find justice and peace. The words captured something essential about Martha's character that Raymond was only now fully understanding. Her quiet involvement with Hispanic families, her recording of Elena's name in her Bible, her years of volunteer work translating and advocating, all of it reflected a conviction that every person's story mattered, that no one should disappear. without leaving a trace. Sheriff Murphy, now fully retired but still sharp and engaged with community affairs, arrived early for the ceremony. He carried with him a small wooden box containing Elena's locket, the artifact that had started their investigation and led to the discovery of her remains. The locket would be placed in a time capsule to be buried beneath Elena's memorial bench, ensuring that future generations would understand how her story came to light. Elena solved her own case, Murphy reflected as they prepared for the ceremony. She left us the clues we needed, preserved the evidence that convicted her killer, and made sure her voice would eventually be heard. We just had to be listening. Carlos Mendez had become a changed man since David Morrison's conviction. Free from the fear that had silenced him for 35 years, he had emerged as a leader in the Valley's Hispanic community, organizing workers' rights groups and helping other families navigate the legal system. His courage in finally speaking the truth about Elena's murder had inspired others to share their own stories of exploitation and abuse. Elena's death wasn't in vain, Carlos said as he helped arrange chairs for the dedication ceremony. Her story has made it safer for others to speak up when they're threatened or harmed. She's protecting people even now. The ceremony began at sunset, when the golden light filtering through the oak trees created the kind of peaceful beauty that Elena had described in her letters home to Mexico. Over 50 people gathered in the memorial garden, Hispanic families who had known Elena or heard her story, church members who had supported the investigation, neighbors who had come to understand the injustice that had been hidden in their community for so long. Father Rodriguez opened the ceremony with prayers in both Spanish and English, acknowledging Elena's faith and her hope for a future that had been stolen from her. Carmen spoke about her sister's dreams and her determination to help her family build better lives, painting a picture of a young woman whose potential had been infinite. Raymond read from Elena's journal one final time, sharing her words about the importance of dignity and respect, her belief that every person deserved to be treated with kindness regardless of their nationality or economic status. Elena's own voice, preserved in careful handwriting, delivered her final testimony about the values she had died defending. As the ceremony concluded, participants were invited to place flowers on Elena's memorial bench and share memories or reflections about her impact on their lives. Many spoke of how Elena's story had given them courage to report harassment or abuse, how her example had inspired them to stand up for their rights and dignity. Daisy, now thriving in her pasture without the burden of secrets hidden in her hooves, watched the ceremony from the fence line. The mare seemed to understand the significance of the gathering, standing quietly as if paying her own respects to the young woman whose story she had helped preserve. As darkness settled over the valley and families began to make their way home, Raymond found himself alone in the memorial garden with Carmen, who would be returning to Mexico the next morning. They sat together on Elena's bench, surrounded by the scent of newly planted flowers and the promise of blooms to come. Elena brought youth together, Carmen said, taking Raymond's weathered hand in hers. Her story connected your family's loss with our family's loss, and from that connection came healing for both of us. Raymond understood what Carmen meant. His investigation into Elena's disappearance had given him purpose during his darkest period of grief, had connected him to Martha's values and legacy in ways he might never have discovered otherwise. Elena's quest for justice had become his own, and in pursuing it, he had found a path forward from the isolation that had threatened to consume him. The memorial garden would bloom every year, a living reminder that Elena Vasquez had existed, had mattered, had made a difference in the world despite her shortened life. Children would play among the flowers. Families would gather for celebrations and comfort. And Elena's story would be told to new generations who needed to understand that justice, though sometimes delayed, could still be achieved. As Raymond walked back to his farmhouse, he carried with him the satisfaction of promises kept to Elena, to Martha, to the community that had supported their search for truth. The empty rooms that had once echoed with loneliness now felt filled with purpose and connection. Elena's voice had called across 35 years of silence. And finally, someone had answered. The memorial garden represented more than remembrance. It was proof that love transcends death. That truth survives even when those who speak it are silenced, and that every person's story matters enough to be preserved, honored, and told. Elena Vasquez had found her voice again, and through it, she would continue protecting and inspiring others for generations to come. In the end, the hardest part of losing someone wasn't saying goodbye. It was learning to live with purpose and the pieces of their world they left behind. Raymond had learned to do exactly that, and in the learning, he had found his way back to the man Martha had always believed him to be.